but I wouldn't trade the way it looks outside for anything. So if you had grown up in the north like I did, spring in the south is unbelievable, because I used to watch the Masters tournament while sitting in snow and could not believe that azaleas would be blooming and there would be leaves on trees. I thought it was all fake. So, but anyway, we're glad for a beautiful morning. We're glad that you're here. I'm going to ask Shane, if he will, to lead us in an opening word of prayer.
Let's pray. Our great and holy God, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the time to come here, to look into your word, to be with people of like precious faith. We're thankful for the word that you've revealed to us, the evidence that you've given to prove your Son as the Son of God, and the evidence of the resurrection, and that we can believe in you and trust in you and to accept your word and then come boldly to your throne. Father, we ask that you be with us as we study this book, be with Byron, help him to have a ready remembrance of the things that he's prepared. Help us to be diligent students to look and to take these things, to understand them and know them, and to be able to put them in our lives and share them with other people. In your Son's precious name, amen.
So what is your impression of the letter to Rome? Before we even start, I want to know what you think about this. We call it a book, but it's a letter. What do you think?
Cutting to the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Cutting to the heart of the matter, that's a very good way to say it. Excellent, actually.
It's epic. Some people think it would be Paul's greatest work.
Okay, it's epic. Some think it's Paul's greatest work. I kind of think that myself. What else?
I've read it and studied it, and there's still sometimes when I read it, I'm like, what exactly is he saying there?
Yes, I've read it and studied it. I look back through my notes. This class is not one that is the first time I've ever done this. I'll give you just a little bit of background. In around 2000, let's see, I would have been 42. And I thought about the fact that I'd never really heard this book presented in a Bible class. And when I would ask questions about it, usually there are two that never get studied very much out of the New Testament: Romans and Revelation. Why do you suspect that people tend to avoid trying to teach Romans?
I think it's very deep. You have to be a premature Bible student to dig out what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I think some of that's true. I believe that it's one, you may need to be a little bit older. What started me was, why doesn't anyone want to do this? And I read it through, like really just sat down. I think this was probably when I began to realize these were letters and I needed to read them all the way through. And when I got done, I was a bit confused. What's really going on in this letter? Before I taught it, I studied it for 6 months. Then I restudied it after I taught it. And then I taught it again. Then I taught it 5 times in a row at the congregation we were at, from middle school to a second adult class to it just. And so I began to see things, but it really kind of left me wishing I knew more. I've also been spending some time, and I hope Jimmy doesn't mind me mentioning this, that we've been reading it together and going over it again, and that's been very helpful for me. So what I want to do is I really feel like this is a harder book, but it's not impossible. The first thing you need to do when studying any book of the Bible is prayer. Paul prayed in Ephesians that the Ephesians would be given wisdom and spiritual insight. And God has promised in James that if we ask in faith, that He will give us wisdom, and He will help us to understand it. I would recommend that you practice reading the book out loud. Not quick, not fast. No one has a timer on you. And that reading it slowly. And for the classes where we start to look at a text, I'm going to encourage you to hand copy that text, especially with Paul, because it helps you slow down and it helps you see what he's saying. Buy some cheap legal pads and do it. You can throw them away and do it many times. I think that myself, every time I go back to this letter, I hand copy the text when I start looking at it. I would also say you really need to look at multiple versions. And the reason I say that is each of the translation committees takes a little different approach to what words they'll use. And I think comparing it across translations actually helps you focus in on what the terminology might mean. You don't have to be a Greek scholar, but nowadays, given that the Bible is online, you can read any translation you want, right? Some are not as good as others, but the ones, I will tell you the ones I will use. I will use the New King James, the New American Standard, the ESV, the NIV, the Christian Standard, and of course the King James and the American Standard versions. If you feel like you understand it better reading the American Standard, you're a better person than me. That is probably the hardest translation for me to read. But when I was in school at Freed-Hardeman, I had to do my memory work out of the American Standard. And I thought that was just because the teachers were sadistic. But I'm also going to recommend some books that I think are very, very helpful. The best one I have seen to give you a basic understanding of Romans is Reading Romans by Robert Turner. Guys, it's like this. It's not that big. And what he does is he walks you through the text and he gets you to stop for a minute and he will take words like faith and put their synonyms in it. He will also help you keep track of Paul's thoughts. It is an excellent book. I'm thinking of all the things I've read, I keep going back to that one. It's based on the New King James text, and so it's very, very easy to walk through. I found that McGarvey and the Gospel Light series on Romans is good. That Robert L. Whiteside is also good. And I'm going to recommend one, but I'm going to put all kinds of caveats around it because the commentator is a Calvinist, but it's about this thick. And it's called Encountering the Book of Romans. What I like about it is this. Obviously, Romans was written, and all of Paul's letters are written in a style and using literary structures that were very familiar to New Testament readers. And Paul will use rhetoric, Greek rhetoric, in writing Romans. He will have debates with imaginary people. In fact, I will tell you that Romans 2 is a prime example, Romans 2 and 3, of an imaginary debate. He will keep talking to you, you Jew, you who say that what he's doing is he's saying, here is a Jewish objection to the gospel. And then he answers the objection. And I think if you know what's going on, it just makes it a lot easier to understand it. You notice I didn't say come to class, because I'm not going to claim that I've got 100% understanding here, but I think we can understand it together. I will also say this is something I learned, which was when you read Paul's 14-verse sentences, that if you drop the parenthetical statement and just read the statement, you at least know what Paul's addressing. Because Paul tends to start a sentence, then here's all the stuff that supports that sentence, and then finishes it. And that can be confusing. I'll give you a couple of prime examples. There's a couple of those in chapter 2. The end of chapter 5, from verse 12 down to the end, has mostly 6 verses or so of parenthetical statement. And then you'll be able to go back and figure out, well, what is he saying here? That particular passage will be thorny for us. Okay. It is a wonderful letter, but it is a letter. How do you read a letter?
Sometimes they say, what is a letter?
Well, that's true. How do you read an email? I know what I do with emails that are bigger than I can see on my screen. I don't read them. And Romans definitely would be one that is longer than that. But for those of you who can remember the Postal Service and snail mail, what do you do with a letter? Yeah. Do you just start by going right into the middle and read a paragraph out of it? No. Well, how would you read a term paper? Same way. You've got to start at the beginning because hopefully there's a logical argument in here, and it will help if you start at the beginning to come to the conclusion and you understand what's going on. Well, you definitely have to read Romans in that way. So I think, and part of the reason we chose Romans and the next letter we're going to read, which is Hebrews, is that understanding it will lead you to trust in God. Sometimes, do you ever feel like sometimes you wonder, am I really saved? Do you ever wonder that? I'm going to tell you, we chose Romans and Hebrews because I think that answers that question. Am I really saved? And what it teaches us is that we, or at least gives us an understanding of the need to trust God and why we should trust God. Because Romans unfolds the great plan of God, the one that He has had since the beginning. Other books talk about it, especially Paul's letters, talk about what this plan is, but Romans spells it out for us, beginning to end. And I think understanding it will increase your love for God. It will leave you in awe of God's plan. It will explain to us terms like what it means when God says He loves us and when God uses His grace and when He uses His mercy. And it will make me understand that I'm saved because only God could make me righteous. I thought about Bill Hall's lesson in last year's fall focus on Paul overcoming self-righteousness. Bill Hall has a unique ability to just put things in really simple terms. The book of Romans teaches us that God makes us righteous. And if God declares me righteous, Bill says, if God declares you righteous, you're righteous. And I believe that message is in this book. But it will also make you sad. Because if you've read the entire Bible, especially the Old Testament, and you read the 4 Gospels, Paul explains what has happened to the Jewish nation, who should have been receptive to this message, but he explains why that is not the case. And we must simply just confess that Peter is right. He said Paul writes in his letter some things hard to understand, and Romans will have that in it. So read this as a letter. Do your best to keep everything in context. So who is addressed? Rome was a city of about 1 million people. That's bigger than Chattanooga. And there are estimates that run higher, but the historical record, we actually have the shipping receipts for grain and other agricultural products that went there to feed the city. So we have a pretty good idea that it's between 800,000 and 1 million. It's also interesting to notice that this book, as opposed to, say, the 2 Corinthian letters we wrote, the Corinthian letters were addressed to a church. But Rome, here, it speaks of the church in a more general sense, and it's actually a letter to the saints who are in Rome. So he says here in Romans 1:7, it takes him about 4 verses or 6 verses to get there, but he says, to who is this addressed? It is addressed to all who are beloved of God in Rome, called as saints. What's really interesting is if you read the first chapter and the last chapter, you can see why he says that it's actually to saints. Look at, let's turn to Romans 16. Romans 16. If I could, I'd like to have someone read verses 3 through 5, and we'll forgive you if you have a little trouble with Greek names.
Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets at their house. Greet my dear friend Epaphras, who was the first convert to Christ in the province of Asia.
Okay, we can just stop there and go, what are we seeing here? What is Paul doing that he doesn't really do in any other letter? He's naming saints. If you look at, let's say, verses 14 and 15, well, let's see here. In verse 5, he addresses a group of brethren who are meeting in their house, which tells us that there's not one big Roman church in Rome. It's like any other city. Especially if you have a city of 800,000 to 1 million people, you're not going to go down, grab the bus, and ride over to the church building, right? You're going to meet in the neighborhoods where you are. He also talks about, and he continues to do this, but he talks about these other brethren, such as that meet with them, or the brethren with them. He says in verse 15 of 16, greet Pelagius and Julia, Nereus and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints are with them. You just go down this list of people and a group of people that meet together. So, how do you think the church in Rome was established? Paul says that he didn't go there. He had never been there.
Well, we know in Acts 2 there were visitors from there.
Right, Acts 2. Let's go over to Acts 2 quickly. And let's read verses 5 through 11. In fact, Shane, if you have it, go ahead and read that for us.
Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God.
So, one of the things we know on the day of Pentecost is that there were Jews in Jerusalem for the Passover and the feast days. And when the first gospel sermon was preached, there were Jews who were there from Rome, and some of them obeyed the gospel. Now, we know from the Acts that the brethren stayed together in Jerusalem until Paul began to persecute the church. What do you think happened when the persecution of the church began, especially to these Jews who lived in other parts of the world? Where do you think they would go?
Home.
They'd go home. And what do you think they're going to do when they get home?
Tell their story.
Yeah, they're going to talk about the gospel. So that's going to tell us some things about Rome, which I want you to think through this with me. When the church in Rome started, what kind of church, who comprised that church? Jews. It was primarily a Jewish church. So there's some things we need to know here, that from Pentecost until 49 AD, this was probably primarily a Jewish church. There could be Gentiles there who traveled to Rome, because a city like Rome is a cosmopolitan city. People travel to it all over the world. So like when we studied the Thessalonian letter, there was a major highway that went to the coast of Greece so that you could take a boat over into Italy, and then that highway would continue on into Rome. And so Jews from Asia Minor, or Gentiles from Asia Minor, Christians, could go into Rome, and they could join themselves to a church in Rome. So, but in 49 AD, the Emperor Claudius, and we can see this in Acts chapter 18. Let's turn to Acts 18. I actually would like for you to be there for a few minutes. This is when Paul left Athens, and he goes to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Well, why did Aquila and Priscilla find themselves in Corinth? Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And so there was a decree. So what do you think would happen to the church in Rome if all the Jews were told to leave? Who would be left? The Gentile Christians. So what do you think happened while that's going on? How would the nature of the church in Rome change? So if you think, what happens? We tend to rely on our older, more experienced members for leadership. Now, just imagine if all the old people were gone. All those who founded the church were just, not just like over time, but like boom, the decree is issued and they're all gone. Well, what would happen? Well, who would become the leaders now? The Gentiles would become leaders. Now, by the time Nero takes the throne, after Claudius is assassinated, that edict becomes a dead letter, and the Jews can return. In fact, in chapter 16 of this letter, Paul addresses Aquila and Priscilla, which means they have left Ephesus and returned back to Rome. They've returned home. And so that's important, because What conflict would Paul have to address in this letter?
Circumcision.
Yes. And not only that, now, before we were the leaders in this church and was pretty much run by the Jews, and now, oh boy, we have some Gentiles and Jews, and they could be, we look at chapters 14 and 15 of this letter, you could see where, oh, there might be some conflict over eating meats, drinking wine, doing things like that, keeping feast days, because probably the Gentiles didn't do it. It's a possibility that when the Jews ran the church or led it, they probably encouraged the Gentiles to give up a lot of these things. But as more Gentiles converts come in, especially those who've been taught by Paul and the other provinces, they're going to come in and say these things don't matter anymore. Right? So that might explain to us why there's 3 chapters in this book dealing with why the Jews have by and large rejected it, and a warning to the Gentiles not to get too big a head about that. That if God rejected the Jews because they turned away from him, what will he do to Gentiles who are not faithful? He can reject them as well. So, there is a timeline here. The problem with most timelines is we have to look at anecdotal evidence for it, right? So, if you go down through this timeline, you'll notice that we can put some markers in the ground about when this letter was written. We know, for example, that in 49 AD, the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. So when we look at Acts 18:2, we have a pretty good idea when Paul was in Corinth. He would have been there around 49 and 50. Now, Paul arrives in Corinth, and that even helps us now. We know when his second missionary journey was. We have a pretty good idea about that now. In 52 AD, and you remember Paul was there for a while, in 52 AD, Paul is dragged before the proconsul Gallio. Now, one of the things you love about Luke is that Luke is detailed in his explanation of things or his recording of history. And I love all these things that Luke put in there because every time experts doubt something, some archaeological evidence comes to mind, and they find out, oh, Gallio was a proconsul in Corinth, and it even has the date when he did it. So that puts us at about 52 AD. We know that from there, Paul travels to Jerusalem and Antioch via Ephesus, and that he left Aquila and Priscilla in Ephesus. So seems like 52 is a big year. Then in 53, after Paul goes back to Antioch and reports on his work he did in his second missionary journey, he then goes back overland and visits the churches in Asia Minor that he had planted in the second and the first missionary journey, and he goes back to Ephesus. And so in Acts 19, we know that he goes there, and he picks up where he left off. But there's just, we have these markers. So we also know that Paul traveled probably sometime between 56 and 58 AD back through Corinth to collect funds, which you just saw in the 2 Corinthian letter. And I have in here he spent the winter in Corinth. I can only say, now that I think about it, we know he spent the winter in Greece because we know he went to Macedonia, we know he went to Achaia. But in all likelihood, Paul wrote the letter after he finished 1st and 2nd Corinthians, after he was already that he may have been in the Corinth area. And part of that is, we know, because in chapter 16, he tells the church in Rome to receive Phoebe, who is from the church in Cenchrea, and Cenchrea is the seaport for Corinth. We got a pretty good idea when he wrote this letter. Now, does that matter? No, but some people think you haven't really studied the letter unless you figure out where it was written and when it was written. There's a lot more here we could say, but there are converts from Corinth that are mentioned in chapter 16. Gaius, who in the first chapter of 1 Corinthians 1 was a convert that Paul talks about in the Corinthian letter. And then he mentions Erastus, who apparently was some kind of city official. He calls him the treasurer of the city. And so the Corinthian brethren had supported Paul during the time that he wrote this letter. Okay. Who is Caesar? Well, I think this is fairly easy to establish, because if Claudius issued the edict to expel the Jews from Rome, and Aquila and Priscilla have returned, we know that that edict no longer is in force. Now, why is it no longer in force? Well, because apparently Claudius was poisoned by his wife, or somebody else close to him. He was fed poisonous mushrooms. In fact, Nero made the observation that mushrooms must be the food of the gods, because after Claudius ate them, he was declared divine. So what you need to know, though, is that Claudius issued the decree that forced the Jews from Rome. So now the Jews are back, and this is probably written during the reign of Nero. Now, what do we think of when we hear Nero? Persecuting Christians, the burning of Rome. How old was Nero when he became an emperor? He was about 17. He was also presented by the Praetorian Guard. This was also, the Praetorian Guard killed Caligula, installed Claudius. Then when Claudius was killed, they installed Nero. This was actually the beginning of the unraveling of the imperial family, because it was beginning to turn out that the only way a Caesar could stand in power was to keep his bodyguard satisfied. And that usually involved money. And so the Caesars needed a lot of money to keep the Praetorian Guard paid off so they would live. It sounds like a great thing to become the emperor of Rome. But Nero was actually fairly stable his first 7 years, either because the bureaucracy was able to keep the empire running. But this is what you need to know. Which of these two did Paul have to go and defend himself before? No. Nero. What was the view of the Christian, or of the church, by the Romans prior to Paul's defense before Nero? It was a sect of the Jews. Remember, when Paul goes in Corinth and he's dragged before the Roman proconsul, his reaction is, "Get out of here. I do not care about your internecine fights in the Jewish religion." He didn't see the church as being anything different than the Jews. Now, the Romans believed, and the Romans had legally said, that ancient religions are protected. The Jewish religion at that time was considered to be an ancient and established religion, and so it was considered to be legal in the empire. After Paul's defense, the church was declared an illegal religion. If you notice that after Paul's defense, persecution begins. And the persecution is state action. Now, the Jews persecuted Christians before that, but the Romans just saw that as like, you guys quit fighting, just stop it. But after they understood that Christianity was something different, the state saw them as state enemies. And probably there were things they didn't understand. You know from Acts 17 that the accusation against Christians was they declared that Jesus was king. Well, that was like saying that these guys are a threat to the empire and to the stability of the empire. They actually weren't, but the Romans didn't take a lot of time to sort things like that out. So what you need to know is that this all occurs, and the church in Rome is peaceful, probably because we haven't gotten to the point where Paul is in the end of Acts, which is he's gone to Rome to defend himself. Any questions about that? All right, Jewish versus Gentile Christians. What was the big controversy according to Acts 15 in the church after Gentiles came in?
Circumcision.
Yes, and keeping the law. Okay? It was probably fairly accurate to say that a Jew could not accept the fact that you could merit God's grace unless you were obedient to the law. And so it became a huge controversy in the church. The reason I'm telling you this is that there are two views of Romans right now. One is that Romans was written to individuals to explain how one obtains the righteousness of God. And we'll talk about what that means later. There's also a view that Paul may have written Romans to resolve a conflict between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and that what he's doing is showing that Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians all are justified in the same way, and that it's not according to law. Okay? And so I think what we need to realize is that Paul does address both of those subjects. He addresses the idea that each individual has a personal relationship with God based on the obedience of faith. But the conflict is resolved because each person is in fellowship with God. And if we're in fellowship with God, then we have fellowship with one another. And that is clearly taught in passages like Ephesians 2 and 1 John. That first of all, you have a relationship with God, and I have fellowship with Shane because of my fellowship with God. If I don't have fellowship with God, then I don't have fellowship with Shane. Does that make sense? And so I think you could break the book up into basically 1 through 8, the fellowship with God, and then 9 through 11, the lack of or the fellowship that exists between Jew and Gentile. And then 14 through 15 talks about what does that mean, or 13, 12 through 15, 16, actually, somewhere in there, it actually talks about how that works out in a practical way. All right, we'll touch on this a little bit more as we go through. That's too small for you to see. But here's the thing I want you to see is that sometimes translators add words. And in Romans, Some people almost always take it that Paul is addressing the law of Moses. He is, but that's not the only law he's addressing. Sometimes in the text, there is a definite article before law, and sometimes there is not a definite article before law. Why does that matter? Because it's true that no one will be justified by deeds of the law of Moses, but the truth of the matter is no one will be justified by any law. It's important because when you speak to the Gentiles were not under the law of Moses. They were under the law of their conscience. How many of us have never violated our conscience? And how many Jews never violated the law of Moses? So the message is, no one is justified by deeds of the law ever. Because if you're ruled by the law of your conscience, or you're ruled by the law of Moses, you have sinned. And everyone needs the grace of God. Okay? Brother Turner said, we are certainly not justified by the law of Moses, but neither are we justified by any law. And so the purpose of Romans, or the purpose of Paul's writing, is to bring about the obedience of faith. I think that is an absolutely critical phrase in this letter. That our obedience, if it is not through trusting faith in God, it's not actually the obedience that God is looking for. And that he is preparing for a visit to Rome. He wants the people to be ready for him when he comes. He has a plan, and he wants to work in Spain. And he wants to use Rome as his basis of operation. You think about it, all of his previous journeys were based out of Antioch and Pisidia. Well, if he's going to move farther west in the empire, you keep your supply line short. And he's going to use Rome as his basis of operations. Clearly, this letter in 1:16 through 17 shows that the gospel is God's power for salvation. And he will show us how God will justify us by faith. And then he's going to give some practical instructions for getting along. I have this in a PDF. If anyone wants this material, I'm happy to share it with you. Okay? So for Wednesday night, I need you to read, I need you to mark up, I need you to think through chapter 1, 1 through 17. Chapter 1, 1 through 17. Any other thoughts or questions? We'll have less lecture in some places, but I don't really know how to present this kind of material without doing that. So, all right, well, thank you.